Okay, well, it looks like we're live. One of the things that I cannot figure out, welcome to Dive into World Building. One of the things I cannot figure out is why it takes so long to set up the YouTube streaming link, but it's okay. I'm just gonna make sure that I mute myself. There we go. And then we can chat. So, yay. So I wanted to talk about character emotions because I think I sort of ran into this funny spot in the discourse about characters and their emotions, where there is a certain group of people who will try to sort of maintain that characters should not have certain kinds of emotions. Otherwise, it's sappy, or it should be termed a romance novel, or certain types of things, right? And I have always been very interested in emotions and psychology, and we've talked about, psychology before on the show, but it seems like it would be worth talking about how culture in a secondary world or in a science fictional, extrapolation of our world intersects with this question of characters' emotions. Because it definitely does. We are taught what to feel about a lot of different things, right? We are taught about what kinds of distinctions we need to draw, and what kind of behavior is appropriate or inappropriate, and a lot of that is very deep and real, and people get harmed, and there are a lot of powerful emotions that people experience. And it's funny because a lot of like epic stories that you hear have people with these very epic emotions, but I think that there are some emotions that are considered more standardly acceptable for epic tales, and maybe some that aren't. You guys have thoughts on this?
Desire for revenge is always acceptable in epic tales.
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, it's the driver for many things.
And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a story we want to keep telling.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that immediately comes to mind for me is the character of Inigo Montoya, who is all about revenge, and how at the end of the story, he kind of like, as I've been in the revenge business so long that now that it's over, I don't know what to do with my life. and that's a pretty deep little moment. And I think, in fact, that it kind of reflects on, it can be considered to reflect on revenge stories in general, right?
Well, see, following the Count of Monte Cristo.
Maybe. Can you expand on that? Paul?
I mean, especially for the movie version, since I suspect most people have seen the movie and not read the book.
I've seen the Mr. Magoo version.
I've never seen that one. but I mean, Dante's is driven by his desire to revenge himself on those who imprisoned him in Chateau d'If, and he goes through all these very complicated schemes to basically put them into his power so he can destroy them. And he has in the movie anyway, he has a chance at redemption that he nearly doesn't take because he's just so driven by the chance to basically puppet and basically torture the people who have tortured him. I mean, at one point in the movie, his commander says, well, why don't you just kill them and just be done with it? And Dante's, and his desire for the revenge, rejects that as a notion. He wants them to suffer as he has suffered. And for him to actually put that down at the end of the movie is a powerful character moment. They actually grew out of this. This thing has defined him for years and years, brewing ever since he was put into the prison.
Well, I
The
think
novel is
that's,
much more complicated as far as his motivations and his ultimate fate. But so
well, it's
it's a
becoming a little
cautionary
more
tale.
common.
Tell
Yeah,
me
but
about it, Kimberly.
well, even crossing out of sci-fi and fantasy and into, sort of modern television, the idea of the revenge story being a character journey as opposed to being purely a revenge story. I mean, how often does the person who wants to get revenge, how often do they actually get their revenge? And the truth of the matter is not often. Right? A lot of the times they come to a point where they realize that they've grown beyond, right? Sometimes they discover the circumstances are not what they thought they were. Sometimes they discover that, getting revenge will harm them more than it will harm the people they're getting revenge on. It's becoming, it's like the redeemable villain trope, right? Like every really popular hardcore villain in season 1 or in film 1 becomes a fan favorite and then has a redemption arc later on. Right? It's the same kind of thing with revenge stories these days, in that nobody ever ultimately takes revenge. They do all of this work, and then all of that work ultimately goes towards making them a better person, right? Or making them somebody who suddenly understands that, the problem lies somewhere else, right? Or that there's a different way to go about this. And so
there are a lot of redemption arcs.
Yeah.
Especially for dudes.
I would say almost exclusively for dudes. I'm trying to think of a gender flipped example, and
Maleficent.
But doesn't in the second movie Maleficent turn evil? I haven't seen the second movie, but that's why I understand what happens. So does that get broken?
It's a justifiable return, and it's not quite a revenge arc. They're trying the course of the movies. They're trying to bring her around to the Maleficent that we see in the Disney film, right? So that's her arc is she could have been saved, but you assholes.
Okay, so it's not an AU. I had the misimpression that it was an AU, alternate universe, but
it's hard to tell with Disney. Honestly, I think Disney tries to validate everything. They're like Homestuck. If it exists, it's part of the expanded universe.
Well, Kill Bill Parts 1 and 2 was a kind of an ultimate revenge flick, right, in the martial arts genre.
Yeah.
And there was
there's a lot of revenge for women.
Yeah.
Revenge is not exactly what we were asking about, I don't think. We were asking about redemption. Because like if you want to just talk about revenge, you could talk about and very often revenge arcs for women are about previous violations that they had suffered, which I really, really dislike. An example that was extremely popular is the Millennium series, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, etc. But yeah, so revenge, I guess that's an emotional state, a desire for revenge.
Well,
it's anger and righteous indignation.
Yeah, anger and righteous indignation definitely have a place. Righteous indignation is starting to be more popular for non-male characters.
Again, Kill Bill, that's all about that, right?
Well, yeah, I need to see I need to see Terminator Dark Fate, because I'm very curious to see what they did with it, and I haven't seen it yet.
They did some good things with it. I know there are a bunch of people who are upset, because there always are, but I actually thought it held up very well.
Yeah.
For what it was. And they definitely do some expectation flipping with it, which is kind of where Terminator was going anyway.
Yeah.
Is the messaging sort of changed over time, but they did a good job, I think, with that.
Well, are you going to catch her and put her away? I'm trying. Okay, or get help, but I'm on a show.
Now that I think about it, redemption arcs. Also, this sort of ties into Maleficent. There's a Disney kids home movie series that my children are very into called Descendants.
Yep.
Which is the generation after all the Disney villains. And they're the descendants of the Disney villains. And they start off as anti-heroes in the first movie because they're all, they're bad. And because they've been treated all their life as, well, you kids must be bad because your parents were bad. Which is an interesting arc to explore anyway, right? Because that is how we treat kids in human society. If their parents were, well, your parents were no good, so you're no good too. Teachers, everyone, community.
Yeah, I mean, and that's often an individual alignment thing, but it also applies to individual behavior, I think.
Sure. But so these kids were like, they start off the movie like they're the bad kids, right? They know they're the bad kids. They've internalized this narrative about themselves and they've acted it out. And they acted out in the first movie. And then it's like a multi-film redemption arc kind of thing, right?
But to get back, to pull this back around to emotions a little bit, it's interesting that the one-note emotions are the ones that we see pop up again and again, and those are the ones that are sort of genre defining, right? So we have revenge, which is usually driven by pain and injury and hurt and anger. And then you have, romance, which is presumably driven by your, organs. And
well, also,
and,
pain, and you have to overcome the pain and injury for a romance, right?
Potentially, you have to overcome something, yeah.
Yeah. There's 5,387 Hallmark Christmas movies for a reason, right? that resonates.
But
right. But actually, it's important to acknowledge that those are not recognized as serious cinema. Sure. And I think, in fact, that there are the emotions associated with them are directly linked to misogyny and they're insulted because of that. They are sort of portrayed as less worthy for storytelling. I mean,
because
the romance
they're of
genre
interest to women
huge and gets a ton of flack.
Yeah, sure. They go into the misogyny bit. Yeah, because they're women's emotions, and so
fiction for women. Therefore, it's not as valued as fiction as like Hemingway, like Let's Go Wrestle a Lion kind of fiction.
Well, and on the opposite side, if you watch the clips they use for Oscars, right, for when they're announcing the Oscar candidates, the women's clips for Best Actress are always women screaming or punching or hitting somebody with a crowbar. And the men's clips are always men crying. And it's this.
I guess both of those show range.
Well, I think it's interesting, and it maybe is worth looking at the subtleties.
A typical thing for their gender.
No, exactly, but also it speaks to sort of the subtleties, right? I mean, within a romance, right, you may have a range of emotions, and I think the better, more powerful romances that you see out there are ones that, okay, this is about love, great, but the actors or the writers are encompassing all of the micro emotions that go in there, right? And I think one of the things when you wander into these narratives that are more universal is that they encompass a broader range of those little emotions within sort of the big picture. Right.
I was actually just watching today something on a YouTube channel called Cinema Therapy, which is actually really interesting, highly recommended. And it was basically a therapist reacting to the movie Inside Out.
Huh.
and analyzing why it was so insightful and like pointing out places where the movie had tackled very real psychology and made it metaphorically and visually comprehensible to small children and how valuable it had been. And I thought that was really cool. And they do there's another one where they analyze Tangled and talk about gaslighting. So this is a fun channel that definitely
Nice.
looking at. But it is. But I thought it was very interesting because it talked about one-note emotions and how they grow into more sophisticated emotions, and every last little detail was grounded in something very specific about the nature of memory and the nature of our emotional reactions to our memories and that kind of stuff. It was really cool. Definitely go check out the video. I think it's worth articulating with that kind of complexity. Obviously, if you've read my work, you know that I think it's worth articulating with that kind of emotional complexity in characters, no matter who they are, you know, regardless of gender or you know, social identity, whatever.
That makes me think of emotional intensity in as depicted by characters. I mean, it gets derided as melodrama, but characters feeling things intensely is something that works of fiction sometimes have trouble grasping with or wanting to engage with, especially film, but film and movies. Oh, it's derided. Oh, that's melodramatic. You're being melodramatic, as in having too intense an emotion is a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right. But I think, I think a lot of people have pretty intense emotional lives.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Lots of people, I mean, we're not Vulcans, we're not Data, but to depict characters having
Vulcans have very intense emotions. Sorry, can't correct you.
Okay. So yeah,
extremely intense emotions. That's part of the deal.
So yeah, so characters displaying intense emotions is just how life really works, but that gets downgraded and deflated in fiction. I'm not sure why. Is it because we're embarrassed by intense emotion, or we idealize less intense emotion, or we see ourselves in that and it's uncomfortable?
I think a lot of people are uncomfortable or embarrassed when they feel intense emotion. And I think there is gender difference in that. But I think even, you know, I think across the board to some degree, if you're, you know, heavily empathizing with somebody else's emotions, it can be unsettling, right? And certainly, you know, when we're listening to a sort of a legendary depiction of something or other, we're not expecting to hear a lot about the micro expressions of somebody's face or the you know, one single axis of conflict in an emotional state is like, ooh, this guy has complexity, right? Like, so I think a lot of that is very simplified. But I think novels offer us such an amazing opportunity to really dig into people's internal states, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, you might even say that's how the novel got invented. A Tale of Genji is about a character who it's all about the emotional states.
Yeah, it is absolutely about the emotional states.
So I had a couple of examples of emotion in cinema I'd like to mention.
Sure.
One of them is Casablanca, where Rick, as Humphrey Bogart, is clearly suppressing his emotions at the beginning. And when his old flame walks in, she's also been clearly suppressing her emotions. And they're putting them together. The conflict of the movie is that suddenly that comes out. The suppression fails. And then they have to, in order to succeed and save the world from Nazism, they have to suppress their emotions again. And the epic struggle of that.
And that's the win.
They have to sacrifice
in this situation, but it's tragedy because that's the win. It is shown to be tragedy, which is a part of, I think, why this movement movie is so brilliant, right? And then I also like to mention the movie Gattaca with Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman, where the characters live in a world where emotion is not expressed very much, and they fall deeply in love, but their emotions are really understated. And I read some criticism of the film where critics were like, there's not enough emotion being shown here. I don't like it. There should be more obvious emotion. And I'm like, no, the whole point is that it's there, but it's very quietly portrayed because everything in the world is controlled and bounded and limited and partitioned. And that's part of the point. But the emotions, it's clear the characters all have and Jude Law's character, who is full of regret and fear of failure and suicidal tendencies and all that, his emotions are extremely strong, but he expresses very few of them, right? You know, and the critics didn't like it because the emotion, it was a romance. They felt, well, there was no romance. How did they get together? I'm like, it's obvious they're deeply in love, right? You just have to, it's subtle. It's subtle.
Well, I mean, there's part of it is the world building aspect of it, right? If the way that you're going to fall in love and express that love in one world is not going to be the same as the way that you fall in love and express that love in another world.
In their world, handing your potential lover your DNA test results is a way of expressing love.
Yeah.
And trust.
Yeah.
And trust, yeah, because it's dangerous. I mean, it's a lesser movie, but this also makes me think of the movie Equilibrium, where you have a future dystopic society where everyone is being drugged to suppress their emotions by law. And when the main character stops, what's that? What's that, Cliff?
I just want to say it's not a lesser movie. Equilibrium rocks, but go on.
Well, lots of people would consider it so, but I have it in my DVD collection, so judge me if you will. So, so when the main character stops taking the drug, he starts feeling for the first time, and he doesn't know what to do with this, and he meets a character who does, and he explains to him that managing emotions without a drug is the hardest thing, and the character has to learn that in order to succeed in toppling the regime.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, and that's actually taking part of the problem that we've been talking about and sort of promoting it into the sort of core premise of a story, right?
Sure.
You know, how are you taught to manage your emotions? There's a whole set of lessons that we get taught about that, right? As and actively taught as children. I mean, none of this stuff is sort of, well, you'll just figure it out from context or whatever, you know. I suppose it must be said that across cultures, people approach the management of emotions differently, right? So, you know, you could say, well, in what context does one discuss with one's children the management of emotions? It may not be that you discuss it with your children. It may be teachers that discuss, you know, emotional management with people or that kind of stuff.
Part of the genius of Fred Rogers was he discussed emotions with children.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah. And a lot of, so when I was writing Mazes of Power, just to put my own personal perspective from my own project into perspective, I was not trying to have it be particularly intense. I was trying to have it be very, very close point of view. And to me, very, very close point of view means that you experience things as the character experiences them, which means that you experience them in the order that they experience them. You something happens, the person perceives it, the person reacts to it, then the person like has an emotional judgment of it, and then the person decides on how they're going to respond, right? And it was because of that sort of point of view decision that I end up getting very deep into people's emotional reactions to things. And so I've actually seen a lot of people say, "Oh, the people in this story have such intense emotions." And I'm like, yeah, I guess, but like, it's interesting. It's just that I chose to show it as opposed to
you did, and I even called it out in my review. So I'm going to read a line from my review of Mazes of Power. This is rather incestuous, listeners and watchers, but so we go. The characters are passionate, driven, and significantly larger than life, and in a good way. One can call them operatic in that full vividness of how they love, hate, strive, and act.
Nice.
He's a good
that's
writer.
a good sentence.
Paul's a good writer.
Yep. But speaking of operatic, operas, oh my God. Emotions
operas
so
are
intense,
all
they
about
can
the
only
opera.
be expressed by arias.
Yeah.
We can only express our emotions through singing.
Through particular singing. One of my favorite arias is in the opera Otello, where Desdemona, having been strangled mortally wounded by strangulation, nonetheless sings an aria before expiring.
It's the thing you do.
Yeah, but it's like, and then he doesn't strangle her anymore when she finishes the aria. She just finishes dying of strangulation after the aria, which I've always assumed that's just going on in her head.
It's a sort of swan song, right? Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. I just find emotions really interesting, and digging into the nuances of that is really one of the things that I like to do. So,
Yeah, well,
and people don't always understand their own emotions either. They feel them and they don't necessarily, analyze them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are a lot. There are a lot of sort of filtering analysis levels in a lot of fiction where we're kind of told what people are feeling. And so in a way, it's sort of like a show don't tell, almost like a show don't tell issue, on the emotional level for characters. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it was just an authorial choice on my part. I just like doing it that way.
All right. Well, speaking of emotions, don't be upset, but I have to go run the swim team carpool. So I will see you all later.
Kimberly, thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
You bet.
Bye,
guys.
Stay safe. So, yeah. Let's see.
So, could we talk about how societies, because we're talking about characters and emotions, how societies tend to filter emotions? One of the things that I found interesting, and I don't have the source, was an article about people with schizophrenia who hear voices. The things that the voices say are society specific. So if you're, for example, Belgian, you won't necessarily hear the same thing an American or a Taiwanese person would hear. And in America, they tend to be suggestions toward violence, but that's not universal.
Right.
So that's an example of society filtering, because that whatever societal forces are acting on schizophrenics are clearly acting on everyone in the society. And so, what is an acceptable emotion? Obviously, in the US, we have very gendered emotional pathways. Men are supposed to feel, anger and patriotism. Is that an emotion? Patriotism, anger, patriotism, and
pride.
Pride.
I mean, I think pride goes to
pride
goes to patriotism. So.
Right. And so women are not expected to have much in the way of those emotions, but they're supposed to have love and nurturing and care. I mean, it's all baloney, right? But it's there. And other societies can break that up in different ways, right?
It's a pattern of selective promotion and a suppression of particular emotions, right?
And it's also class driven. as well, and race driven, right? Like if you are a black male in the United States, you have to be very good at hiding your emotions from police officers, right?
Well,
That's
presumably.
important.
Yeah, I mean, they call it the talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
I
yeah.
mean, if you're working class and you're working as in, this was big in the day in service, right? If you were in a great house in Europe, working as a maid or a footman or a cook or a butler or a valet in England or valet, you had to suppress all your emotions in front of your employer, right? And often in front of, the people under you in, obviously, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of that in Mazes of Power, right? But
I was also thinking Merchant Ivory films.
Yeah, that too.
So, so when you're world building, your characters, there's whatever feelings your character has, and those can be driven by your character's perceptions, right? Like wounded pride only happens if your pride is wounded, which could be culturally specific. There are some, I don't know how many emotions are really, I mean, there's happiness and sadness and anger and whatever, but it's the same thing. You have like 10 different people from 10 different societies and you give them the same stimulus, you might get very radically different emotional reactions to the same stimulus.
Absolutely.
And
I think a lot of it has to do with, associations that people have with past experience as well.
And assumptions about their place in the world.
Is the cultural teaching. But yeah.
And so if you're creating a fictional setting in which the characters have emotions, there are appropriate emotional responses considered by their society, and then you can exploit those, and you can also exploit a character having a different emotional response than the appropriate one, and exploit the tension between the expected emotional response and the emotional response the character finds themselves having.
Have we seen a lot of science fiction or fantasy in which cultural groups are distinguished by the way that they express emotions or the emotions that they choose to express in dramatic ways?
Other than Vulcans and Star Trek? Like I said earlier, they have very strong emotions.
We've seen plenty of non-expression of emotions. I'm talking about alternate expression of emotion. Like, I mean, I guess we could say the Klingons with their sort of rage-based, but that's not really what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, that's not really, that's not quite.
But like, if you have a particular feeling, like say that you were supposed to be expressing, goodwill and a desire to have a diplomatic relationship, you could serenade the other person with an epic song about the future of your two peoples. And like, I mean, the thing is that yeah.
So one of the interesting notes, a performance note, when Tom Baker played the Doctor in Doctor Who, he deliberately played him having inappropriate emotional responses as part of his facial acting. So like when they find out, we are trapped in a lighthouse with a horrible killing monster, he gets a big grin because he's happy. Because he is suddenly, good, I get a problem this all right. He's an alien. And Baker's said this in interviews that because he was playing an alien who just looks human but is actually alien, one of the ways he made that actually alien was to have him do inappropriate for a human emotional responses to the situations that he found.
Well, inappropriate manners is definitely one of the sort of markers of, hey, I'm an alien.
But interestingly, when Colin Baker 2 Doctors later tried it flopped. So the Tom Baker was able to sell in a way Colin Baker could not.
Partly that was scripts.
That was also partly script too.
Yeah, if you listen to the Big Finish audio Doctor Who adventures, Colin Baker is my favorite audio doctor because they started writing good scripts for him, and he's brilliant. He's utterly brilliant. So I recommend Doctor Who and the Pirates, which is Gilbert and Sullivan Doctor Who, and he sings.
Really? Huh. I think I know that.
Mm-hmm. Anyway,
that takes us back to opera.
That takes us back to opera.
Yes, it does.
Actually,
Operetta anyway.
You know what?
Operetta in space.
So let's talk about space opera for a minute.
Oh, good.
Oh, good.
So the as I've heard it said, one of the reasons why space opera is called space opera is because it's sort of sweeping and dramatic and emotional. Am I right about that?
And it came from horse opera.
No, it came from soap operas.
Oh, I thought it came from horse opera. Okay, I'm wrong. Oh,
yeah.
Well, wait. So for a second, let's pause and say, what is it that makes it fill in the blank opera as opposed to something else?
So there's the scope.
Scope.
Okay, scope. Like
an early space opera was very serial in nature, like a soap opera, like Flash Gordon and like the Buster Crab Flash Gordon and the Buster Crab Buck Rogers, and Buster Crab was just everyone.
Space opera.
Yeah, new space opera is different, right? It takes the tropes of that and does other things with it. But the original space opera, like the Lensman series by E. Doc Smith, or Flash Gordon, or Buck Rogers, or whatever.
Getting galaxies.
What would you say about? So what would you say about Ann Leckie's work? The Imperial Radkai series. Is that has been referred to as space opera?
It is absolutely new space opera. So new space opera was a genre invented by Ian Banks, essentially. But also Alistair Reynolds and Ken MacLeod. It was a British thing in the 1990s, and where they decided to take the big tropes of space opera, but tell non-cheesy stories in it that were at least somewhat scientifically plausible. So, and then that got taken up across the Atlantic, as the New Wave did in the 1960s, and it's become a thing. So new space opera is, there's Hamilton, there's
The Expanse.
The Expanse series.
That's the best known
space opera. But it started in the UK. It wasn't. The
Expanse and Hamilton's UK himself. So yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. So Leckie is
American.
Is American.
But I think that for Leckie, I think that's more like. Well, is it scope or is it emotion? Because I think her portrayal of emotion is actually pretty restrained.
Yeah, it's more scope than emotion. Yeah.
It is about scope. Werner Vinge is a big name in American new space opera, with A Fire Upon the Deep and A Deepness in the Sky.
Yeah, so those are the ones that are called space opera too, because of their scope.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
And also the size. Like there's 700, 800 page books. But there's Deepness in the Sky is set mostly on one planet in one solar system, so it's really...
So like also I was thinking like KB Wager's series is scope, but it's also very intense emotion, because you have a former princess on the run turned empress who has to save herself and her civilization. So. And
Star Wars is space opera.
And Star Wars is space opera.
What about
it's also space fantasy.
What about Unconquerable Sun by Kate Elliott? Is that also space opera?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I would say so. Right?
Alexander the Great in space. There's
Alexander's not a restrained person, and neither is
Dune is space opera, right? So the Dune series,
and that's mostly set just on one planet. 1.n planets, but it's all about Paul's intense
that has these big looming figures and influencers for sure.
It's just about the entirety of known human space, and it involves the emperor of the galaxy. So yeah, it's a big canvas. I mean, it's implied, but it's big.
It's just an emotional canvas, because Paul is basically, I mean, especially when she gets to the next books, trying to fight a future, and he feels intensely about this problem.
Sure.
And fails, but he fights all the same.
Yeah, and then in the Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson books go all over the galaxy to all different planets, Caladan and wherever. So they expand the canvas that.
So you don't have to have giant emotions and say so, but it certainly helps. I mean, they're not a requirement, but they certainly get paired often enough that that they're part and parcel, even in with the new space opera.
So before we wrap up, I want to kind of take a look at this one other thing, which is that back on the idea of which emotions are allowed to drive plot. We talked about revenge for quite a long while, but like grief is a big one. Recovery from trauma is another one, right?
Oddly, in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and to a lesser extent the movie Blade Runner, empathy is an emotion that drives plot. It's the big engine that drives the story. Whether or not you have empathy, right? The androids or replicants in the movie don't have empathy. I would argue at the end that Roy Batty develops empathy.
Oh, absolutely.
And that is the arc. And I would also say that Harrison Ford's character, Deckard, is emotionally distant at the beginning, but he's been trying to suppress the emotions he felt, because he did feel empathy for all the replicants he retired in his previous employment stint. And that's why it's clearly why he quit. He just couldn't take it emotionally, right?
So I think there's also a cultural, a big cultural ingredient in how we decide which emotions are going to drive our plot, right?
Sure.
This whole idea of trauma driving a particular character is so ingrained in our stories that I find it rather distressing. You know what I'm saying? It's like, how many characters do we hear about in our common literature where they've lost one or both parents in a horrific manner, right? And that's underlying a great deal of how they respond to everything in their lives, and not even in a psychological way, but in a just sort of very sort of, well, this explains why this person's super messed up and does X, Y things. It's not examined so much as it's just sort of said, well, you understand, it's because of this trauma. Here we go. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, Joseph Campbell had that as a stage in the hero's journey. The whole family has to get the axe, or the village, or whatever. And then,
well, but okay, so
then,
like that's obviously something that happens in a lot of stories. It's not required, clearly.
Every Disney cartoon ever, right?
Right.
Disney movie.
But see, that's what I find super troubling. That's another cultural ingredient where it's like, yeah, let's kill off the mom.
Yeah, it's almost, it's very often the mom.
It's a form of fridging.
Yes.
It is. But it's also...
and fridging itself was a way to try to get an emotional stake on a character.
Yeah.
It's like,
and this is one of the reasons why I like to try to keep people alive. because I want to explore a world in which, people being killed is not our primary driver.
There's also the sort of pragmatic side of the storytelling. If your protagonists or protagonist are children, then you have to deal with the fact that children have parents who protect them. So from harm. And so if you want to put your child protagonist in harm's way repeatedly during the plot of the story, you have to shuffle the parents off stage in some fashion or other.
Not really. You can put the entire family in danger. You can have the protection be effective to greater or lesser degrees. You don't have to shuffle the family off to one side. It's just a very common trope in our.
It's very convenient. I mean, you didn't shuffle off Tamalera to one side in Transgressions of Power. She's right there along with everybody else. She's in the stews. I mean, she still has to deal with her sons.
I mean that has specifically to do with my interest in aftermath states.
Well, yes, but it would have been easy, especially since there's a time gap. I guess I'm spoiling a little bit ahead of listeners. That you could have put those characters on the side, but you didn't. You could put the mother on the side. It would have made sense, but you did not. You chose not. You chose to increase the emotional states of the characters by having her there, especially if in the reveal.
Yes,
which is nicely fresh. I'm going to tie it into something a little earlier and say Land of the Lost. Which is a Sid and Marty Krofft live action show from the 1970s in which a father, a widower, and his two children are stuck in an interdimensional weird place called the Land of the Lost.
Marshall and Holly.
Yes, on a routine expedition. Anyway, there is an episode. Well, first of all, the fact that Rick Marshall, the father, is there for the audience identifiable characters, Will and Holly, is extremely important. It's one of the few Sid and Marty Krofft where the kid isn't on their own somewhere, like on some island or something, or in a giant hat. So he's there to help them survive because it's a very dangerous environment and to teach them, wilderness survival skills, but also to be the emotional anchor for them. And there was an episode written by Ben Bova of blessed memory, in which Rick Marshall is injured by these stones that can cause electrical discharges. And Will has to go talk to Enoch the Altrusian, who is a native of this realm, but from a high civilization, and beg for help. Enoch the Altrusian, by the way, was created by Walter Koenig of Star Trek Chekhov fame. But anyway, David Gerrold was the story editor, and he got all his friends to write episodes. And so Enoch has his own emotions, but he's an Altrusian. He's kind of like a crab-like, insect-like being, bipedal because the actors are in outfits, but he's not a mammal. And he doesn't have a mammalian brain. He has and this is very clear whenever he's on stage. And so Will says, you got to help my dad. And Enoch says, well, I've just opened a gateway to your world. You should go through now. It's your only chance. And Will says, I can't leave my dad here. And Enoch's emotional reaction was, well, now I have to help your dad. How dare you shame me into looking bad, right? It's his culture. And he's like the only Altrusian in the room. Everyone else is in a different time period than him. But he embodies his culture. And in his culture, it would be emotionally shameful of him to continue his own journey to his own time rather than rescue this human's father because he's got this one shot at it. Because he's now shamed by from Will's perspective, it's just like he loves his dad. That's his emotion. But from Enoch's perspective, Will is trying to shame him in the Altrusian cultural way. And he's not going to let that happen because of his pride in his Altrusian superiority. It's like 25 minutes, and it's all about emotions and human emotions and Altrusian cultural emotions, and also the fact that Altrusian brains are not human brains.
They're not human brains, but they're close enough. Like when Enoch finally figures out what the Land of the Lost is and where he's wound up in relation to his own culture, the tragedy of Enoch cuts me to the bone. It's like, oh my God. When Edith finds out, we the watchers find out, it's like, oh, that is devastating to us and
heartbreaking. I was
Yes.
heartbroken when I first saw that as a kid. And that's the Walter Koenig episode where he first appears.
Yeah.
Well, how about that? And it's now 5:03.
We'll leave it on that.
Excursion into the land of the lost.
Welcome to the land of the lost.
So thank you for being here and chatting with me. We are going to continue chatting. I'm in talks with Jamie Go to arrange a new for a new guest, and we're gonna see what comes out of that. I'm kind of excited about it. But we haven't really talked nitty-gritty timing yet. So for the moment, I'm going to say, let's see, what's next week? Oh yeah, we can see each other next week. I guess we'll just be in touch about topics and such. But I appreciate you being here. I appreciate people who watched, and we will